African Americans, I should say, have played roles since the first calls for independence from Britain. This video will focus mainly on the contributions to the American side of the conflict. However, African Americans fought for both sides during the conflict. For example, Colonel Ty fought for the British. Overall, 5,000 to 8,000 African descended people served on the American side, and 20,000 or so for Britain. They fought for the side that would be more likely to give them freedom after the war. They played a variety of roles in combat and in support roles, even following their masters into battle, as was the case of George Washington's servant. African Americans served throughout the war, from the first battles in Lexington and Concord to Yorktown, which was the decisive battle. African Americans played crucial roles in the early days of the conflict as Minutemen, which were groups of men that were ready to fight at a moment's notice or at a minute's notice, hence the name Minutemen. Also, later in the war, once African Americans were readily accepted because the supply of men was needed to be sustained, and before this point, George Washington, among others, in the American leadership roles, did not think it would be a good idea to arm African Americans because they thought that they would pose a threat to their owners, among other things, or in the case of slaves, their owners. The First Rhode Island Regiment was the first all black unit in the war. Also, some people, such as James Armistead Lafayette, were used as spies for the war. He actually worked on both sides. He was a spy for the French because of his extensive knowledge of the terrain of Virginia, as he had been born into slavery, and he freely went back and forth between sides during the war, so he was a double agent. He also befriended the Marquis de Lafayette, the French general that was instrumental in getting French support for the colonists, which turned the tide of the war in the Americans' favor. So he befriended the French general and took part of his last name. His actual name was James Armistead Lafayette, and he switched it to James Armistead de Lafayette. For the most part, African Americans played support roles, although there were other African Americans that played important roles in combat, such as Salem Pork, who actually killed one of the British generals during the Battle of Bunker Hill. The first, some would say, martyr for the American cause was actually an African American. Crispus Attucks is believed to have been the first person killed in the Boston Massacre. So he was the first martyr for the American cause, and that is how African Americans have been involved since the very beginning of the American Revolution, or what would become that revolution. Most African Americans, however, served in support roles rather than in combat roles, such as cooks, laborers, craftsmen, drummers, flag bearers, couriers, and medical assistants. It should also be noted that the Navy was more accepting of African Americans than other branches of the American forces because of the fact that African Americans worked in shipyards and had been present on ships in the past as well. So they were more open to having African American soldiers, whereas the First Rhode Island Regiment was uh, not obviously an army or a navy regiment. So it took a little longer for foot soldiers to be African Americans. And also, as I mentioned earlier, George Washington's manservant went into battle with George Washington. So this was common for generals to have a slave go into battle with them to assist their masters wherever they went. In conclusion, African Americans played more than just supporting roles in the Revolutionary War. They had instrumental contributions from the early days of the American Revolution, when Crispus Attucks was, by some accounts, the first martyr for the American cause, to the deciding battle of Yorktown at the end of the American Revolution.